Welcome to the Missing Pages, where we explore science and history that you might not find in your average textbook. My name is Lee, and my co-host Kausar and I are both scientists. This means we spend a lot of time being curious about things, and the history of science is no exception.
Our understanding of science is built on thousands of years of knowledge from all across the globe and all kinds of people. Yet, we're often taught that a majority of the scientific knowledge comes from a very limited part of the world. That's why we'll be highlighting the science and history from outside of Europe that has been foundational in our understanding of the world today, but is often left out of the story.
Whether you're a curious mind or a fellow scientist, join us as we uncover the missing pages.
Medical science is a branch of STEM that I think everyone can relate to. I mean, since we all have human bodies. The progress we've made in medical research in just the past 100 years alone is truly impressive. To think in less than 100 years, we've gone from understanding and discovering DNA for the very first time to being able to pinpoint the specific spot on a DNA strand, the specific genes that are responsible for an entire complex disease. But all this progress wouldn't be without the contributions of scientists, researchers, innovators across the world and throughout time. Which is why in this video, we will be taking a look at what the exchange of knowledge looked like historically, how figures like Ibn Nafis and later William Harvey played a role in what we know now regarding the circulatory system, and we'll take a bit of a turn and look at a blood disorder in both a scientific and anthropological view. To end off, we will be talking a little about the concept of the scientific method. A common theme throughout this series has been that science is an accumulation of knowledge from centuries of work done by people across the globe. So to start, I asked Dr. Fancy to give us some more insight into what this looked like historically.
So societies across the pre-1800 or pre-modern era, as we usually refer to them, constantly were interacting with one another through trade and also various types of intellectual and scholarly exchanges. So in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, the scientific corpus, including philosophy and medicine and sciences such as alchemy, astrology, and even magical sciences of various kinds, were translated from Greek, Middle Persian, and even Sanskrit into Arabic. Arabic texts were translated into Latin from the 12th century onwards, and we also have a Chinese medical work that was translated into Persian in the Mongol court in Tabriz by the vizier Rashid ad-Din of the ruler Urjatu. And Rashid ad-Din was in fact a physician from a Jewish background and worked with an intermediary who could help him with the Chinese text and translating into Persian. In the 11th century or thereabouts, Arabic pharmacological texts were being translated into Greek in Byzantine territory. The interesting part of some of these translations is that they use the Arabic term written using Greek letters for many of their entries. Yet then the translator proceeds to explain that this transliterated term, Arabic term into Greek, is actually this Greek term, which he knows. But then he still continues to use the transliteration, the Arabized term, rather than the Greek term. Showing that in the Mediterranean in the 11th century and beyond, the Byzantine Greek authors felt that one needed to know Arabic because that was the dominant scientific language in the period in the region.
We're going to take a look at one person in particular, and that is Ibn Nafis. He made many contributions to medical science, and specifically the circulatory system. We will discuss how his work was part of a process that later impacted the discoveries made by the more commonly known figure, William Harvey. But before we dive in, to truly understand the gravity of the discoveries Dr. Fancy will tell us about, it's important to remember that basic knowledge like blood is essential to life wasn't always known, and we only know it now because of the work done by these folks.
So Ibn Nafis was a 13th century physician who was also trained as a religious scholar and philosopher. He composed works on prophetic traditions, Islamic law, logic, and philosophy. The bulk of his work, though, was in medicine, the most important of which was his multi-volume commentary on Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine. So all of Ibn Nafis's new claims, such as the pulmonary transit of blood, his new account of pulse, digestion, humoral theory, are all found in his commentary on the Canon of Medicine, which he completed in his 30s. His commentary on the Canon of Medicine, on the other hand, was widely disseminated and used by physicians in Islamic societies from 1300s till the 1800s and beyond. Ibn Nafis never proposed the circulation of blood per se. What he did was he rejected and modified earlier theories of Galen, the 2nd century Greek physician. He, however, recognized that blood was naturally present in the arteries, and so he felt that some small portion made its way from the veins into the arteries, and according to Galen, this was through invisible pores in the septum wall that divides the right side of the heart from the left side of the heart. Ibn Nafis challenged this specific belief. He claimed that the portion of blood that makes its way into the left side of the heart and so into the arteries does not come through invisible pores in the septum wall, but rather through the lungs. This is a very novel and an essential step for the modern theory of circulation, but Ibn Nafis has no concept of circulation. Nonetheless, Ibn Nafis added one more crucial aspect to what will be important for the circulation of blood, which is his new understanding of pulse. William Harvey was an English physician who died in 1657. He had received at least part of his training in Padua in Italy. Ibn Nafis's pulmonary transit and his understanding of pulse as a movement of this fluid-like movement in the arteries caused by the motion of the heart are key components of Harvey's theory, without which you cannot have a theory of circulation. In the 1540s, which would be about 80 years before Harvey published his text and his views, Ibn Nafis's views on the pulmonary transit of blood and his pulse theory were being debated and assessed in Padua, also where Harvey received his training decades later. So Harvey is rightly credited with the theory of blood circulation, but the various pieces came together through the works of others, which included key insights and arguments from Ibn Nafis. Again, an aspect I would emphasize is that even once Ibn Nafis's new theories are introduced and debated in Renaissance Italy in the 1540s, it takes almost a century for the theory of circulation to come through.
So even though we talked about these two key figures, Ibn Nafis and Harvey, it's important to once again acknowledge that it was a process, and they're only two of many people who helped build the theory of circulation that we have today. This is only a glimpse into the many missing pages. Let's fast forward from talking about Ibn Nafis and Harvey, who researched the basics, the foundation of blood circulation in the 13th and 16th century, to talking about where we are now. Looking at the 19th century onwards, having the knowledge about the basics from historic researchers, scientists are now able to go even further by working to understand the more complex, like blood disorders. We look at various branches of science as distinct and separate from each other. In school, you would have learned chemistry as a separate unit from biology, or history as a different course from science. But in a lot of ways, these topics aren't that distinct. Next, we will hear from Dr. Burden, who studies genetics from a medical and anthropological context, specifically in regards to a blood disorder.
One thing that has interested me a lot in the course of my research is the overlap between the history of medical genetics and anthropological genetics. The birth of medical genetics as we know it now and the birth of anthropological genetics was done through the study of more or less similar sets of genes. And so in my own research, I've focused on sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease is an inherited medical condition which is caused by mutations in the gene that produces hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is the protein in your red blood cells that carries oxygen from your lungs to other parts of your body. So obviously it's a protein that plays a very important role. Under certain conditions, it changes the shape of your red blood cells so that normally your red blood cells are round. However, the mutated hemoglobin can cause them to form a flattened or a sickle shape. I think many people will be familiar with the story of sickle cell disease and how it's commonly racialized, especially in North America, as a disease that predominantly affects Black people, people of African descent. However, what many people might not know is that sickle cell disease is also extremely common in parts of the Middle East and India and South Asia. And it was actually the discovery in the early 1950s by scientists working in the Middle East and India that sickle cell disease was prominent in so-called white racialized people, or people who were not known to have African ancestry, that contributed to a major shift in the way that sickle cell disease was understood as a genetic condition. Prior to that time, it was conceived as being an indicator of African ancestry. So when patients in parts of North America and in a few cases in Europe were found to have sickle cell disease or to carry the sickle cell trait, that was considered to be an indication that these people had some kind of African origin. So in that sense, it was considered to be a racialized disease, that even though we understand that sickle cell disease is a medical condition, it was associated very strongly as a way of tracing anthropological origin. So that's why I say there hasn't historically been this sharp division between medical and anthropological genetics. Now, the discovery of sickle cell disease, sometimes in surprisingly high rates in different populations in the Middle East and India, that narrative was forced to change, right? So these discoveries were really important in the eventual acceptance of the idea that sickle cell disease isn't always an indicator of ancestry, whether that be African or another kind of ancestry. So Middle Eastern scientists, Middle Eastern patients with sickle cell disease, all the people who played a part in the discovery and treatment of sickle cell disease in these other parts of the world, gradually contributed to this major international scientific debate about how do we understand the origins of sickle cell disease and where it's distributed in different parts of the world. So now people might also be familiar with the notion that sickle cell disease is related in its distribution to areas of the world which have high rates of endemic malaria. They might be familiar with the understanding that there's an evolutionary connection between the presence of malaria and the natural selection toward people who carry the sickle cell trait.
What is Dr. Burton referring to when she mentions the evolutionary connection between malaria and the natural selection for the sickle cell trait? To answer that, affecting humans and other animals, malaria is a life-threatening infectious disease. The parasite moves through the bloodstream and infects the organism's red blood cells, which is why it is transmitted by mosquitoes, which, feed off blood. It is thought that if a person carries the gene for sickle cell disease, their blood cells would have an abnormal sickle shape, and therefore a less than optimal environment for a parasite to thrive in. This means if a person had the sickle cell trait, they could be more resistant to malaria, and these individuals would likely live on to reproduce and pass on their traits, meaning, evolutionarily speaking, these traits would be selected for, whereas maybe those without the sickle cell trait are more susceptible to malaria and therefore would be more likely to die before passing on their genes. These traits would not be selected for, since they are, not successful.
It's important to understand that the first time that this hypothesis was proposed, again in the early to mid 1950s, it was not immediately accepted. In fact, it took a few decades for people to come around to this idea and to find the real evidence that sickle cell disease is actually caused by multiple different kinds of genetic mutations. There's not one single mutation at the DNA level. And therefore, you can't understand sickle cell disease only through this mechanism of anthropological ancestry. You have to also account for other kinds of evolutionary processes. And so it was this research being done in India, in the Middle East, which helped eventually to confirm this new vision of this new understanding of sickle cell disease.
All of this research on the circulatory system, blood disorders, and diseases would not have been possible without individuals asking questions and then testing those questions. Similar to the discussion in episode 1, We were taught that legitimate science was a Western way. In my education, the concept of scientific method was always credited to white men. The scientific method being the process in which you make an observation, ask a question, create a hypothesis, test that hypothesis with an experiment, and then analyze the results. Well, surprise, it wasn't just white men who were asking questions and then testing them. I had Dr. Fancy tell us a little about what this looked like in his research.
The one aspect that is probably shared widely is the notion of establishing and proving one's claims rigorously, often through, not exclusively, but often through rigorously set up experiments with well thought of controls. So we can think about clinical trials and how they're conducted for drugs or vaccines. For the medical works that I read, rigorous investigation and proofs were the norm. And these proofs could be philosophical proofs or empirical proofs. The latter often included the kind of rigor we associate with modern science and scientific medicine. Now, finally, to pick up on what would be really a classic scientific method type of experiment, I want to turn to Ibn Nafis's commentary on the canon from 1242 CE. So first he identifies a problem. He comes across this notion that the masses state that snow, even though it is cold to touch, has a warming effect on the body, which is why people feel thirsty after consuming it. The physicians, on the other hand, laugh at this and make fun of it. So he turns around and he says, well, let's test it, right? His hypothesis, based on the arguments and stuff that he makes, he agrees with the masses, stating that snow is inherently, once it loses its accidental coldness, warm in its potency. So it has the same effect on the body as other warming medications, right? So this is kind of his, you can also see it as a hypothesis. And then he provides 5 arguments for us. The first of it is the following experiment. So I'm going to use 2 containers, same size, made up of the same substance. Then we're going to fill them up with the same amount of water from the same water source. Then we're going to place them in the exact same place, which is extremely cold, so that the water gets as cold as it can get without freezing. Then take them and place them elsewhere, again, both of them together. And only in one should you put snow, but not in the other. And at that point, he says, check the one that has the snow. You'll notice that it's colder than the one without snow. Then he says, leave it and return back after some time, and then feel them again, and you'll find out that the water that had snow in it is warmer. Right. So this is a wonderful display of what we teach as a scientific method, especially since he claims he has also repeated it many times and found the same result. So the repetition part comes in as well. However, I will end with the following caveat. His experiment is also a good reminder for us that a method is no guarantee for the validity of a theory. His experiment is very rigorous and works, but his theoretical explanation for what is going on is wrong from what we know now. For Ibn Nafis, his world is made up of just 4 elements that are a combination of the 2 pairs of contraries, cold, hot, and dry, moist. So fire is hot and dry, air is cold and hot and moist, etc. His rigorous controlled experiment yields real empirical results that we can even duplicate now. However, we would explain the results very differently, since we no longer uphold a theory of 4 elements. We would instead explain the result using our modern theories of specific heat capacity, in which snow has a lower capacity than water, and so forth.
It's easy for us reading to make the assumption that these discoveries were immediately recognized as being correct and important and influential, and it leaves out the fact that we discover in historical research that many times these experiments or these discoveries were at first rejected and were subject to, very passionate debates. I want to put front and center the notion of science as a process, the really important role of these international debates to replicate and interpret the data, that there's a huge number of people involved, not just one grand person making the discovery.
So to wrap up, I asked Dr. Fancy and Dr. Burden if they were adding to a science textbook, what would be on their missing page?
Well, because I work so much on Ibn Nafis and some of these Arabic medical commentators, I think for me that will be the big one, is to highlight just the accomplishments and the intellectual rigor and transformations of medical theory that were undertaken by Ibn Nafis and his subsequent his successors, and also by some of his predecessors, who usually are left out of these stories.
If I had the opportunity to edit or revise a science textbook to fill in the missing pages, I would emphasize the number of people that were involved in a long process, a slow process, in fact, of contributing data, of interpreting results. I also would want to foreground the contribution, especially in the cases of medical science, of research subjects and patients, who we tend to leave out completely. There was this older practice, right, of tending to name diseases after people who discovered them. And increasingly, I think there's a move to try to shift towards naming conditions either after patients or, what I think is better, after the biological process that causes them. What I want to teach students, what I want to see in new science textbooks, is to move our thinking of science as a process, as the result of interactions and collaborations between people from different parts of the world, and to shift our sensibility that a few important geniuses have somehow done all the work.
Thanks for watching The Missing Pages. We hope this gives you a more accurate picture of the history of science and the peoples who continue to play a part in shaping our view of the world today. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more content and follow SciExchange on social media.